What happens when it's not a tattoo? It's a brand from the auction. Apache woman said, "The rancher wept?" Witness this unbelievable, true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly across the dusty plains as Thomas Whitmore stepped onto his family's ranch for the first time in 15 years. The old wooden gates groaned under their own weight, echoing the burden he carried in his heart. He'd inherited this land from his grandfather, a man whose legacy was as complicated as the desert wind, unpredictable and harsh. Thomas had always known his grandfather as a stern cattle rancher, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. But he'd never questioned the source of the family's wealth or how the Whitmore ranch had grown from a modest homestead into one of the largest spreads in the territory. That ignorance, he would soon learn, was a luxury he could no longer afford. As he walked through the old barn, running his weathered hands along the wooden beams, he discovered a locked chest hidden beneath loose floorboards. The key hung on a rusted nail nearby, as if waiting for this moment. Inside, he found ledgers, old photographs, and documents that made his blood run cold. Bills of sale, transaction records, human property listed alongside cattle and horses. His grandfather hadn't just been a rancher. He'd been a buyer at the auctions where Apache people, particularly women and children, were sold as indentured servants after the Apache Wars. The practice had been legal, justified by those in power as civilizing the savage, though history would remember it for what it truly was, slavery by another name. Thomas felt sick, the wealth that had educated, the land he stood on, the very boots on his feet, all of it was built on suffering he'd never acknowledged. He spent that night on the porch, unable to sleep, staring at the stars that had witnessed so much pain. The next morning, a figure appeared on the horizon. As she drew closer, Thomas could see she was an elderly Apache woman, walking with a cane but with a dignity that seemed to radiate from within. Her face was lined with the stories of 8 decades, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're the grandson," she said simply, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Whitmore. I'm Mary Neshoba. I came because I heard a Whitmore had returned. I didn't think I'd live to see this day." Thomas invited her into the house, offering water and shade. They sat at the old kitchen table, the same table where his grandfather had counted his profits and planned his purchases. "I knew your grandfather," Mary said, her voice steady but weighted with memory. "I was brought to this ranch when I was 7 years old, bought at an auction in 1892, along with my mother and little brother." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I found the records. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Mary nodded slowly. "The comfortable never do. That's how comfort survives." She rolled up the sleeve of her worn cotton shirt, revealing her right forearm. There, faded but unmistakable, was a mark burned into her skin. Not a tattoo, but a brand. The letter W inside a circle. The Whitmore Ranch brand, the same mark that had been burned into the hide of every head of cattle his family had ever owned. "It's not a tattoo," Mary said quietly. "It's a brand from the auction." Thomas stared at the scar, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't control. "My God," he whispered. "My God, they branded you like animals." "Not like animals," Mary corrected, her voice firm. "We were treated worse than animals. Your grandfather loved his horses. He was gentle with his dogs. But us, we were tools that could be replaced." The rancher wept then, really wept, his shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. All his life he'd believed in the righteousness of his family name, the honor of frontier legacy. Now it crumbled to dust. "I worked these fields until I was 23, Mary continued. "My mother died here, broke her back, and never recovered. My brother ran away when he was 14. I never saw him again. When your grandfather finally released me, he didn't apologize. He just said times were changing and he couldn't afford to keep me anymore. No payment for 16 years of labor, just a warning not to cause trouble." "What can I do?" Thomas asked, his voice raw. "How can I possibly make this right?" Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the land she'd once worked against her will. You can't make it right. What's done is done, and those who suffered most are in the ground. But you can do what's just. Over the following weeks, Thomas worked with Mary to identify other survivors and descendants of those who'd been held on the Whitmore ranch. There were 7 still living, scattered across Arizona and New Mexico, all carrying similar scars, visible and invisible. Thomas did something his grandfather never would have considered. He began dividing the ranch, parceling out sections of land to each survivor and their families. He established a trust fund with the proceeds from selling the main house and the majority of the cattle. He worked with tribal councils to create a memorial on the property, listing every name he could find in his grandfather's records. The local community was divided. Some called him a fool, throwing away his inheritance. Others whispered that it was performative guilt, too little and far too late. But Thomas didn't do it for approval. He did it because Mary Neshoba had shown him the brand on her arm, and in that moment he'd seen the truth of his family's legacy. On the day of the memorial dedication, Mary stood before the gathering, her great-grandchildren beside her. She placed her hand on the stone monument, reading the names carved into its surface. "This doesn't erase the past," she said to the crowd. "Nothing can. But it acknowledges that we were here, that we suffered, and that we survived. Our names are in stone now, not just in ledgers recording our sale price." Thomas stood apart from the ceremony, knowing it wasn't his moment to occupy. He caught Mary's eye across the distance, and she nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could. The brand on her arm would remain until her last breath. The scars of history don't fade simply because we acknowledge them. But in choosing to face the truth, in taking action that cost him everything comfortable and familiar, Thomas had done something his grandfather never could. He'd chosen justice over legacy. He'd chosen the present over the past. And he'd learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't wealth or land, but the courage to confront the sins of our fathers and make what amends we can. The Arizona sun still blazed mercilessly across those plains, but the shadows of history, at least now, were brought into the light. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Whisper of the Past for more forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. Share with us in the comments where you're watching from and what historical truths you think need more recognition. Remember, we cannot change the past, but we can choose what we do with its legacy. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers.